migratory bird navigation. But before I do that, I thought I would first tell you a little bit about myself, or how my work led me to this topic. So my background is in mathematics and GI science, and about 11 years ago, I started working in movement analytics, and this was through Cost Action Move. If you're not familiar with cost actions, these are European networks where you have people from the whole of Europe working on a similar topic. And MOVE was a bit unusual because it had methodological researchers on one hand, so people who are doing GI science and computer science and so on. And on the other hand, there were people who were actually interested in movement as a phenomenon in their discipline. So they were collecting movement data on people, animals, and so on. So we had transportation people, people who study human mobility, people who study movement ecology. And this sort of started a community that has grown over the years, and it has led now to this idea of the integrated science of movement, where we are trying to bridge the gap between these different disciplines. And because we realize that there's really a lot of similarity between disciplines, and on the other hand, some disciplines have solutions that others don't have, and so it would be a really good thing if we could bring this together. And within this integrated science of movement, what I'm trying to do is try to use my knowledge of spatial temporal analysis to solve different problems in movement ecology. And in particular, one problem that I'm focusing on is the migratory animal navigation, or bird navigation. Actually, we're looking at birds. So movement ecology has actually undergone a really big data revolution in the last year, sort of similar as this has been happening with human mobility. So, you know, nowadays everybody's collecting GPS data from mobile phones and so on. And movement ecology is getting there because the sensors are becoming smaller, the tags are becoming cheaper. You can have more things on each sensor that are being measured. You can have more high precision measurements of location, and it's going towards a so-called Internet of Animals, which means that it's sort of an analog way as the Internet of Things, that you will have all these animals walking around having the tags, and we will know their locations, and you will be able to find out about the world and about themselves by just looking at this data, in the same way as this is happening with humans and with things. And in ecology, this means that the whole paradigm of how science is done is moving from a question-driven approach, where you started with a hypothesis and then you went out and collected the data, towards a more data-driven paradigm, which is similar to what you encounter in human mobility, GI science, that you just collect a lot of data and analyze that, and that then brings you to the question or to the hypothesis, which you then test. And one of the areas where this, I think, is really important, a data-driven approach, is animal migration. And you may not know, but animal migration is a really common thing. So here I have a visualization of tracking data of mostly birds from MoveBank. So this is a data repository from Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior. And now we are in March, and you can see lots of these birds moving from Africa up to Europe and from South America up to North America. And they will go all the way up to Siberia, and then they will winter in, over the summer, they will spend in Siberia, and then they will go back. And if you look at these tracks, right, most of them are dead straight, right? So they just know where they have to go. So basically what they're doing is they're doing something called true navigation, which means that they find their way to a faraway place using just local cues, because they cannot, if they are in Germany, they cannot sense the things down in Africa, but they are still able to just, you know, take a straight line, go down, get where they want to be. Or look at these guys going across the Indian Ocean. So how are they able to do that? This is something that animal ecologists are studying, and it's something that's not really easy to study. So, but for this kind of navigation, what has to happen if you consider this as a process? Well, there are two things. First of all, the birds need to know where they are. So this is called geographic positioning. And this can be done through map navigation. So they can look at visual landmarks, they can smell their way through olfactory environment, or they can use, for example, magnetic field. And then they have to know which way to go. And this means that they need to sort of find a direction. And this is done then through compass navigation, which they can use the sun, the stars, they can use the polarized light that tells them where the sunset and the sunrise occur when there's cloud cover, or again, they can use Earth's magnetic field. And in particular, how they use Earth's magnetic field is a really big question, and nobody really understands how they sense it and then how they use this information. And traditionally in ecology, there were two ways of testing this. One was that you had lab experiments where you caught your birds, you put them into cages, which are, can you see my mouse or do I need to make it into a cursor? Can you see my mouse?
It's fine, it's visible, yes.
Okay, so they put them in cages that look like this. They're called Emland funnels, which had paper all around here, and then they were covered. But then when the bird wanted to migrate, they opened it and then it scratched the paper in whichever direction it wanted to go. These days, they do it with computer vision, so it's not necessarily paper anymore, but all you got in this case was where the bird went as it departed, and nobody was really tracking them. I didn't know what happened after they departed. That has improved recently when they're trying various displacement experiments. So for example, either taking birds somewhere else or just creating fake magnetic field inside these cages, and also maybe including some tracking, but still it's not really clear what happens after they depart. And most of the, there have been some simulation studies of how birds could have done it, but most of the simulation studies only assume that magnetic field changes across space, but not in time. And so what we are trying to do in my project is that we are bringing a completely different approach to this. So we're bringing this data-driven data science approach, where we are going to use open tracking data on many individuals and species from MoveBank. So this is, MoveBank is a data portal for animal tracking data hosted by Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, who's a partner in this project. And we will link that to open environmental data, in this case, geomagnetic data, and then look with various data science methods what really happens in the wild, so when birds are on the move. And most importantly, the one thing that's really new here is that we're looking at the geomagnetic field as it changes both in space and time. So if you have a magnetometer, this is the kind of output you get, and you will see this is clearly changing over time. And even more than that, if you are up in the Arctic or on the Antarctic, and if you have seen northern lights are basically a visualization, if you want, of the changes in magnetic field as the magnetic lines move under the influence of the solar wind. So perhaps you're not familiar with magnetic field, or maybe you learned this ages ago in school. So I thought I'd just have one slide where I explain what is magnetic field. So the Earth is basically a bipolar magnet. So it has a north and a south pole, but the north pole is actually in geographic south, and the south magnetic pole is in the geographic north, and they're not aligned with the north-south axis. They're a bit displaced. And so we have these field lines going from the north magnetic pole out through the surface of the Earth, and then around and then back. And when you measure this, you measure the vector on these lines. So this vector B is what you actually measure. And this vector has certain properties because it's a field quantity. So one of the things we can look at is the intensity. So that's the length of this vector, or how strong is the field. Another one is the angle from which it goes out of the Earth or into the Earth. So down here, this is negative because it's going out, and then down here it's 0, and then down here, up here is then positive, up to 90 degrees at the northern magnetic pole. And then we can also look at the declination, and declination is the angle between this vector, if you project it on the horizontal plane, and the geographic north, and this also varies on the Earth. And the strength, I didn't mention this, the strength also varies from about 30,000 on the equator and 60,000 on both, nanotesla on both poles. And that looks really nice, but of course we are dealing with nature. So in fact, it's not that simple, because this very nice circular field that I showed you is in reality really squeezed by the solar wind. So the sun keeps emitting particles and sending them out into the solar system. And as these particles reach the magnetic field, they get deflected on both sides. And depending on the strength of this wind, then the shield, the magnetosphere, actually gets distorted. So in my previous nice 2 parts of the magnetic field are now this small blob here, and then this back blob gets extended like out of the way far out of the screen here. And as the Earth rotates, this one becomes this one. So because this is on the sun side and this is on the night side. And additionally, the solar wind is not constant, so these distortions vary, and they can be really big during times of the so-called geomagnetic storms, which occur when you have a lot of explosions on the sun or big explosions on the sun that send stronger wind, more particles. And because of the geometry of the solar system, the interesting thing is that most of the storms actually occur around equinoxes, which are coincidentally times of spring and autumn bird migrations. So if birds are using magnetic field for navigation, they could actually be disturbed by the storms, and we should be able to see that because most of that actually happens when they are actually migrating. But we don't know. I mean, nobody has ever looked at this in that perspective yet. So, and how they could be disturbed? Well, again, just to give you a visual representation. So this is how do we see storms or how can we sense the storms? Well, we can sense them with instruments, but how do we see the storms? Well, storms actually send lots of particles into the upper atmosphere, which then excite gases, and the result are northern lights, aurora borealis. And as this magnetosphere is pressed by the solar wind, and the stronger the wind and the more distortions, the lower the aurora gets, and the lower, I mean, it goes from high latitudes down to lower latitudes. So this is actually in St. Andrews. This is a photo from my living room window. So I have a really nice view to the northern horizon here. And on the 6th of March, 2016, there was a huge geomagnetic storm, which actually brought us aurora. So you could watch it here. And if I was a bird and I was flying over St. Andrews, normally I would feel my magnetic field like this. But during the storm, it becomes much more steeper. So the lines, the columns that you see in the aurora are actually the direction of the lines. So what that would mean for me, if I am using magnetic field for navigation, it would just suddenly mean that suddenly I'm not in St. Andrews, suddenly I'm somewhere else. So there is a possibility that this could completely distract me and confuse me, and I wouldn't know where to go. So in this project, we are looking at, well, a few things, but the things I'm going to talk about from this project is first, how can we study this? And to study this, we need to link satellite geomagnetic data with tracking data. So that's the data fusion part. And then I'm going to look at two questions we can now ask. So how are migratory flights affected by geomagnetic storms, if they are affected? And then what strategies do migratory birds use? So which of the properties of the magnetic field do they use and how do they use them? And this is now published as these two papers. So if anybody's interested, I can send links later, or I don't know, Anna, if we will have PDFs of presentations available, people can have a look at it. And then I'd like to conclude with some ideas of where this can lead and what other possibilities we will still have with this new data-driven ecology. So we want to link tracking data to magnetic data because that's the only way that we can actually find out what happened as the birds were flying, wherever they were flying. And to do that, we chose the satellite geomagnetic data from swarm satellites these are in orbit since 2013. They are by European Space Agency. And basically, there are 3 satellites, 2 of them who orbit in parallel, and the third one orbits perpendicularly, and they are in polar orbits. And the nice thing about this, or any ESA data, is that everything is free and available online. So basically, you can go there and download data from the satellites. And great, we can just link this to tracking data. Except, again, it's not simple, because these satellites are not really remote sensing satellites in the traditional understanding of what a remote sensing satellite is, because those are normally satellites that take pictures of the surface of the Earth, right? So you would get raster remote sensing data, either optical or radar or whatever, you would sort of have an image. But these ones don't do that. These ones just fly around and measure magnetic field wherever they are. So that means that we have this problem that we need to take our tracking data, which is a set of points on the surface of the Earth, and then find point data at the satellite level. So they are at about 400 or 500 kilometers up, and then somehow link them together. So it's a complicating 3D data fusion. And in addition to this, it's even more complicated because we also need to take into account not just how magnetic fields changes across 2 dimensions and time and so on, but also that this changes quite a lot across elevation, and in particular, in different parts of the atmosphere, different things happen. So to try to then use this measurements at the satellite level, what we had to do was we had to disaggregate the magnetic field measurements in the way the geophysicists do. And I'll just briefly explain this. So when you measure the field, wherever you are, let's say at the satellite level, this field can be mathematically decomposed into various contributions that come from different sources. So you have the core field, which is caused by the rotation in the Earth's core. You have the crustal field, which is contribution from magnetism in the rocks in the Earth's crust. And then you have the magnetosphere contribution. And these are typically put together into a so-called chaos model, or they can be different models. We are using the chaos model. And these can be modeled. And then on top of that, you have this yellow part here, which is the contribution or the effect of the solar wind. And this is something that cannot be modeled. This can just be measured by the satellite. So what we do is when we get our measurements, we get this, but what we want is we want the field down at the level of the bird. And because these contributions of the field vary with the elevation and in complicated ways, what we do is we just take residuals from the top here and then plop them on these models at the level of the bird to get something like this. So that will give us a more accurate result down at the lower level where the bird is. And we do that by interpolating the residuals. So basically I'll go from right to left here. So we look at our GPS point. For each GPS point on our bird trajectory or animal trajectory, it doesn't have to be birds, we find the nearest satellite points and we take the residuals from the satellite points and we interpolate them using space-time kernel, which I will talk about in a moment. And then we take these interpolated residuals and plop them on the model from this lower elevation at the location and time of the GPS point. And the space-time kernel is defined based on the orbits of the swarm satellites. So we have a spatial circle within which we look for satellites. This is smaller towards the poles because swarm satellites are in polar orbits, so you have more orbits nearby. And then we also have a temporal component that allows us, so temporal window again based on swarm orbits, and within this spatial temporal kernel for the interpolation, we also define spatial temporal distance for interpolation. So it's inverse distance weighting interpolation. And the result is then something like this. And so basically we have trajectories of birds. Here I have some geese who are going down from Siberia to Germany in an autumn migration. And we annotate each of the points in these trajectories with the field values, the actual measurements, and then various values, intensity, inclination, and so on. And also the storm index, so that helps us tell if there was a storm or not at that specific moment in time. And note that these are not static maps. So this is basically what the bird encountered as it went, right? So if it was in this location, it had this much horizontal intensity. This is implemented as a Python tool in Jupyter Notebook called MarkGeo. You can go to GitHub and play around with it in case you want to test that on your own data. So using this tool, what we can then do is we can start asking questions that ecologists were not able to answer before. So one thing that we looked at is, are birds affected by geomagnetic storms? So I was telling you how the sun sends all these particles and everything gets messed up. So do the birds actually get confused? And for this, we took data from MoveBank with 22 greater white-fronted geese on an autumn migration in 2017, going down from Siberia down to Germany. As you can see, pretty straight lines. But there was a large geomagnetic storm in September of that year. And on this map, you can see the locations where the birds were during this storm or some other storms that occurred during this period. And you can see the tracks are normally pretty straight, but look at this weirdness going on during the storm. So this one started circling. This one seems to start following the coastline, which it didn't do before, the same one there. So what's going on? Well, we can look at various properties of movement to try to answer this. So we separated the data here into the storm and no storm points, and we just plotted the distribution of the speed on each point and the turning angle. So turning angle is between two GPS segments, what it's doing. And if you look at no storm conditions, I mean, they go dead straight, right? So turning angle is 0, they just go, right? And for the speed, there seems to be like a peak around 60 kilometers per hour. So this one here is where they are, for example, in stopovers and so on. So we're not interested in these lower speeds because they're probably not flying. But the optimal migratory speed seems to be about 60 kilometers per hour. But if you look during the storms, you get something really different. So first of all, many more turning angles. And the second thing is that we have this peak here around 100 kilometers per hour. So it seems to go faster, right? Is that really the case? This is 22 individuals. I cannot generalize more than that, but we now have another paper in preparation where we are looking at several hundreds of these and so also other species to see if we can replicate this result. And this is indeed what is happening. So stay tuned for in the next few months. Another thing that's interesting is how do they actually use these geomagnetic values to navigate? And for this, we tested several possible strategies. These are all egocentric navigation strategies. So that means that the bird is looking at what's happening in the environment and then orienting them itself based on the environment, the state of the environment. And we tested two strategies for compass navigation. So finding the direction, and two strategies for map navigation. So the compass navigation, the two that we tested were the so-called geomagnetic taxes, or in human wayfinding, this is sometimes called beaconing. So that means that you look at where you are, you look at one value, so let's say intensity, and you find where the highest intensity is, and then you just fly or just move towards that highest point. So this is your beacon. And then we also looked at constant heading. So again, you are somewhere, and then you're somewhere, and then you find that highest value or lowest value, could be either. And then you keep the constant angle to that value. So you don't go to the value, but you just keep it on your right. So sort of like sailors do, right? And then for map navigation, we tested two types, bigradient map. So this means that the bird could be using two geophysical cues as two-dimensional map. So in the same way as we are using east-west and north-south directions, they could just use intensity and inclination, for example. And then also map and compass navigation, where they use landmarks or some cue to find where they are and then find the direction using a compass from the same cue or another cue. So it's the same as if you go hiking in the mountains, you need to find out where you are on the map, and then you use the compass to find out in which direction to go. And we did this by using agent-based models. So in ecology, agent-based models, and in particular correlated random walks, are very typical way to model movement. So if you're not familiar with this, a correlated random walk means that you have an object, or a bird in this case, moving from one position to another, where at each position it decides how far it will go and in which direction it will go. So it decides what is its turning angle and what is its step length. And so that's a random walk. But if you then add that the step lengths are linked to each other and turning angles are linked to each other, you get a correlated random walk. And in particular, these are step lengths and so on are then usually chosen from properties of actual movement. So you take real trajectories, you calculate the distribution of turning angles and step lengths, and this is where you draw them to then generate this new simulated set of locations, so a simulated trajectory. So what we did was we biased these correlated random walks with contemporaneous and co-located geomagnetic data, which we got with our tool. And we looked at intensity, inclination, and horizontal component, because these are the values that are hypothesized for the birds to be able to sense. And so we then simulated this in many ways. So if you look at the central point here, central panel, I have this real trajectory. This is one goose going from Siberia down to Germany again. And if there is no bias from magnetic field, my simulations can just go wherever they want, right? So these simulations are based on the movement of the bird, but not biased with anything. But what we did was then for each strategy, so compass navigation, map navigation, each value, intensity, inclination, and so on, we created a probability surface with which we bias these walks. So here I have a probability surface for geomagnetic taxes for the lowest value of intensity. So wherever the bird is, it's moving towards this point it's more likely to be moving towards this point than somewhere else. And if you put that into the random walk model, your simulations sort of start trending towards the end of this trajectory. And we did this for all the strategies and all the values and created thousands of simulations. And then we calculated similarity of these black lines to the actual data. And then we looked at the ones that had the best similarities. So which were the strategies and which geomagnetic values we used in these strategies that were the best or the most similar to what is actually happening. And you can read all the results in the paper. I will just show you one which is really striking, which is that when we looked at the top 10% of simulations, we basically didn't find almost any using inclination. So what this table shows you is that here are the various values that were used in each strategy. So all the strategies with just intensity were here, with just inclination were here, and so on. And then I have three trajectory similarity measures: mean distance, dynamic time warping, dynamic interaction index. And if there was no influence of magnetic field, we would have a seventh of each. We would expect about a seventh of the simulations in each of these cells here. So this would be equally distributed and about a seventh in each of the rows. That's clearly not the case, right? There's lots of strategies that just don't have any representations in the best 10% of simulations. And interestingly, this is mostly the ones that use inclination. And so we were thinking about like, wow, how can we explain this? And I think we can explain it like this, that we need to consider of how these values change over space, but also what birds can sense. So if you look at how the intensity changes, it changes about 10 nanotesla per kilometer, and inclination is about 9 thousandths per kilometer of a degree, while as birds can detect 20 nanotesla in intensity and 1 degree in inclination at most. So that means that the bird would have to fly 2 kilometers to sense a change in intensity and 120 kilometers to sense a change in inclination. So this is quite a long distance, 120 kilometers, but 2 kilometers, it's more feasible that there's actually going on. So this is something that we thought was very interesting. But again, this work continues with other species and so on. So where do we go from here? Well, I said already more species, more birds, not just more species, more individuals as well. In terms of species, we're now looking at other European, African migrants, so white storks, black storks, some raptors like Western March harriers and so on. And as you will notice, these are all pretty big birds. And the reason for this is that you have to take into account the weight of the animal when you put the tracker on them. So if you look, these storks here have antennas, right? So there's a tracker and antennas on each of them. And the bird would not be able to function normally if this thing was heavier than 3% of body weight. So that's the rule, right? So, and because of this, there is a limit to what size of birds we can actually track, because the trackers can only be made like they cannot be smaller at the moment. There's just no technology that would allow you to make really, really small tags that would still have everything. So all the sensors and the battery and the solar panel and whatever is needed to actually get the data. So at the moment, most of the birds that are being tracked are birds that are large. So these are the ones here tracked with satellite GPS. Max Planck Institute for Animal Behavior currently develops smaller tags, the so-called Icarus tags, which for which there is an antenna on the International Space Station that downloads the data. And as you see, these ones are smaller, so they're basically sort of the size of my finger, my little finger here. And these are called GPS data loggers, and this can then go down to about the size of blackbird, but this is still just starting now, so it's not fully operational yet. So the antenna was delayed because of COVID and so on. So it's only starting now. So at the moment, this means that we can basically track birds on this side of this graph, which shows you the distribution of all the bird species. But most of the migratory bird species are in this area here. So there are small birds, which like songbirds, which we actually cannot track with the GPS to get really high resolution data, which we would need for the kind of analysis that I've shown you just now. And there are other species that are also migratory. It's in fact the majority, and that cannot be tracked with GPS tags. In fact, the majority of migratory species cannot be tracked with GPS tags. So, for example, small birds are typically tracked with a geolocator, which is this kind of tiny tag that determines the location based on the duration of the daylight and the location of the noon. And these ones you have to catch the bird next year and get it off because there's no way to actually send the data back. The tag is just too small. Then we have radio telemetry where you put tiny tags even on insects and bats. So this is really for small animals, but you can only get the location when these animals pass a set of your receivers. So you have no idea what's happening in between. So lots of uncertainty. And then finally, lots of migratory animals are marine animals. So marine mammals and fish. And these you actually cannot track with GPS because it doesn't work underwater. So there's another satellite system called Argos, which is popular for these. But this means that you only get locations as they come to the surface of the water to breathe, for example. And then in between, you use accelerometry to try to do some dead reckoning, but that's again really uncertain and not clear how you could get better data comparable to high precision GPS. So one of the options that we're looking at is how to expand our annotation tool to deal with this kind of uncertain data. And then if we go beyond just looking at geomagnetic navigation and beyond just looking at this particular topic that I was showing you, I think there's so many potentials in trying to cross-link between disciplines and go move as a spatial data scientist towards movement ecology problems. So I already mentioned that there's this Internet of Animals happening, and in particular with tags like Icarus, where you will be tagging many. So Icarus tags are also cheap, so you will be able to tag many animals and they could interact with each other and so on. I think we're going beyond that to sort of, you could call this location-based services for movement ecology, where you can annotate or you can develop tools that will let you annotate this tracking data with all sorts of other information that we have. So for example, there's so many other satellite information there that's not being used at the moment. Now it's typically just remote sensing imagery. So for example, ESA has the Sentinel-5 precursor satellite, which measures the atmospheric composition, and it can catch the level of air pollution and various air pollution gases. Well, birds are smelling things, right? So they smell gases, and some of them have been, like homing pigeons have been shown that they are orienting themselves according to gases. So you could take data, air pollution data from this satellite and again link it and study navigation with that. Or there's tons of other Sentinel satellites which measure all sorts of things from characteristics of oceans, let's go that way, to, I don't know, gravity changes and so on. So again, I'm not sure what that could be useful for, but there are all these data available and you could link them to animal data and try to study animal movement with that. Another development is physiologging, which means that, well, we have physiologging for people, right? So I guess how many of you have smartwatches? I guess many of you have smartwatches. And that looks at your, not just, I mean, you can check your location, you know, you can go, I don't know, for a run, check your location, upload that to Strava, but it also checks things like your heart rate and your sleep quality and all of those things. Well, this is now being developed for animals. So you will have a smartwatch or a Fitbit for animals if you want. Again, another source of data that can be linked with movement data to try to find out what is actually happening. And once you have all these really rich data sources linked together, it can also go into something which I find really exciting, in that these animals, because they're everywhere, you have this Internet of Animals, they become your sensors. So it's sort of like having live drones flying all over and sensing the environment. And you can use the information you get that for all sorts of things. So for example, you could use the information on magnetometry to improve your magnetic models. You can use weather information for climate change models and so on. There's actually already a lot of applications where they're tracking elephant seals who swim around Antarctica to model the oceanographic models. You can also study things like pandemic monitoring, in particular now in the current situation. As you know, the COVID virus probably came from bats. Well, we have lots of migratory bats, so here are some in Europe. You might have some that get infected, I don't know, in somewhere in Russia or Estonia or somewhere. Estonia is that, yes. And then fly down to France and then infect other animals there, and then it jumps to people. So those kind of things. And just yesterday, there was this paper that found that there's lots of white-tailed deer in US, which are actually infected by COVID. So if these deer then get in touch with people, you can get COVID from deer, not just from people. So again, if you had tracking data, you could then sort of try to monitor what's going on. So physiologging for the virus and then tracking data. And you could try to prevent reinfection back into humans. And another exciting idea is to try to forecast earthquakes, which is in geophysics impossible. But there's some evidence that animals may actually change patterns in movement just before the earthquake. So there's a story, which is also a story. There's a paper that's using this kind of tracks and accelerometer data on farm animals, and looking how they behaved just before various earthquakes in Italy. So there's all sorts of possibilities how animals could act as sensors to help us study with the environment. But this all sounds exciting, but all of this needs a really solid data science knowledge, because in all of these cases, you have to link really complicated data and you have to link really huge amounts of data. So I think there are many exciting opportunities for spatial data science, and I'm looking forward to see what's actually happen in the next few years. And with that, I will finish. I would just like to thank my team. So my postdocs, Vanessa and Fernando, and my PhD student, Beate, and my collaborators, Jet, Kieran, Kami, Andrea, Helmut, and Martin. And I would also like to acknowledge support from the Leverhulme Trust. So thank you very much.
Excellent, excellent, Urška. Thank you very much. That was a fantastic talk. I think you demonstrated also the potential of data science in that respect. I have actually quite right away a proposal to you.
Yeah.
Because we are running the journal on LBS. I think it would be a really nice special issue to pick up your idea of LBS for movement ecology. Can you consider that?
We can definitely discuss that, yes.
I think that would be great, actually, just to make that statement which you give in the presentation to become even more visible through maybe a special issue of a journal. Then it would highlight also the whole framework, so to say, with what we are talking about here. So excellent, thanks a lot, Urška. I'm looking now at the questions coming in. I see that Anna has raised her hand. Anna?
Yes, okay, thank you very much. I have one question, Urška, which is about cognition in animal navigation. Do we have such a thing? Because for human beings, we have the concept of familiarity with an environment, the different way of navigation because of the level of familiarity. And I was wondering if there is any knowledge that you can actually comment on the cognition in animal navigation.
Yeah, so one problem with animals is you cannot ask them. Right? So if you talk to people and ask them how they navigate, or if they recognize this or whatever, you can get sort of ground truths or some information about cognition by asking them. You cannot do that with animals. You can only find out about what they could be thinking, if they are thinking, from looking at the data. And there are some recent studies that are actually looking at this. And just recently I saw a study from Ran Nathan from Israel. He's one of the big names in movement ecology, who was looking at bat navigation. And what he was trying to see is how bats are bats using a cognitive map. So a cognitive map in this sense that they know where things are in the environment and they can relate themselves to these things and, for example, take shortcuts because they know that, I don't know, one tree is there, one tree is there, one tree is there, and then I'm somewhere here and I can just take the shortcut to whichever tree. So they've collected And these are for not migratory bats, but just bats that are doing foraging, but going over about 100 kilometers or so, right, range. And so they've developed a system where they can track really high resolution position data, about 1 Hertz. Then they tried testing all these hypotheses. So one was like, okay, they don't do any kind of navigation. One was this, they have a cognitive map, like this complicated cognitive map. One is they do piloting, which piloting means that you know where you just can connect each pair of the 2 landmarks. So for example, if you go to if I was in Glasgow now, and if I never was at the conference there, and I would have to come from my hotel to the conference, I would remember that from this hotel, I go to the coffee place, I go to the park, and then I come to the university, right? But I wouldn't be able to take a shortcut because I don't know how these things are in space. So for going back, I would just have to go backwards. So university, park, coffee shop, hotel. So this is called piloting. So they tested these and some other hypotheses on really a lot of data. So you can read the paper. I'll put it in the chat afterwards. And surprisingly, the only hypothesis that fit was a cognitive map. So this really high level of cognition. You can never prove it because you cannot ask bats, but from these lots of data, it seems that yes, they do have a cognitive map. Now they're trying to do this also for migratory birds, but for migration, maybe it's not that relevant because it's too far, right? So knowing this kind of cognitive map, how things relate to each other is not going to get you from Siberia down to Greece, right? It's just too far. It has to be something else. That's why we were looking at the egocentric navigation methods instead of this cognitive map and allocentric navigation methods, but who knows? So I think, and this again, exciting times because we can collect a lot of data and we can see if we can find out more about cognition in that way.
Okay, there's a question from Mohammed Sharif. I will present it to you. His question is about, well, if you're looking at the pattern analysis perspective, to which extent environmental factor could influence bird movements, like, for instance, greenery, wind speed and direction, breeding, and so on? So that would be his question.
Yeah, so I didn't show you here because this is work in progress, but we are actually linking data to many more environmental things, not just magnetic field. So for example, when we saw this speed bump of 100 kilometers per hour, we thought, oh, maybe they just came into some really high winds, right? And this is why this is happening. So we're linking the data to meteorological models and to cloud cover information and various other things, and we will study all that. And yes, of course, this is all possible. But again, you cannot really ask birds if they are using wind or whatever, because you cannot talk to the animals. But it's actually a very well-developed area in movement ecology. That they are looking for the so-called environmental covariates. So what they would typically do is they would develop a movement model into which they would link all this environmental information from wind to whatever, cloud cover, land cover, habitat information, and so on, and then try to model various movement properties based on that. And this has been going on in ecology for decades. So basically, since they started tracking things with radio tracking back in the 40s, 50s. So it's a very well-established way of looking at environmental things. But again, what you get out of statistical models, because if you don't have because also, first of all, you don't have the ground truth data, like I said, but also because ecology is a really good, or ecologists are trained in traditional statistics. So they will be developing various, I don't know, GLMMs and so on to analyze these things.
Can I follow up on that a little bit in terms of, I mean, if we think bigger, so to say, as you say, it's the Internet of Animals, we will get more and more data, we will get closer, we will get more precise and so on. Could you imagine that by simulating, so to say, influences, variables against each other, that we can answer questions that, well, if that changes, that will happen to the migration trajectories, for instance, because that environmental factor is changing, then we can predict that trajectories or that swarm will go differently. And can you go as far as saying, well, that might be even an indicator for something like climate change?
Yes.
And or the other thing, which is a big discussion in the European countries, as you know, is those windmills, those big windmills, which have an impact on birds.
Yes.
Can you go as far as seeing their a contribution?
So on the climate change thing, I think what we are doing, well, this is at the start, okay? We're not there yet, this is starting now. Mm-hmm. But I think it's actually really relevant because birds, for example, are already changing their migratory patterns based on climate change and anthropogenic change. So for example, there's a huge increase in population in storks in Portugal and Spain, and they're not migrating anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So because storks actually migrate, like they have this inherent direction of migrating as juveniles. So when they are born, they don't go with the parents. Parents go first, and then kids go on their own. And so the first year storks from Portugal and Spain go down to Africa the way they used to go. But then they come back, and then they don't go anymore. So they just stay. They are sedentary. They're not migratory anymore. The reason being that there is so much food available on various trash locations and so on in Portugal and Spain. So there's actually a huge problem. It's like the population increased over several thousand%. And then knowing how behavior will change in this kind of situations, I think it's very important. So linking to magnetic field, for example, is okay. They follow a magnetic field, great, but magnetic field varies across the globe and it varies with time. And so what happens if they have this idea of, they have this innate ability to, or innate idea of where they are and they should follow the magnetic field, but the habitat where this is leading them to is completely different because of climate change, right? They will come to there and they will what, just die? I don't know, right? So no more birds? I don't know. Right?
So what you say?
Really, I think it's really interesting to find out as much as we can to be able to then conserve the species and so on as things are changing. And in terms of wind platforms, I'm not an expert on this, but yes, I have seen a lot of studies both for wind. Oh, come on, now what's the word? Well, wind's not a windmill.
Windmill, maybe?
It's not a windmill. Well, anyway.
No, it's a
these things, okay, both on land and on water. So, for example, Scottish government has just announced a big program where they're going to look at the wind farms in the North Sea and how these are affecting seabirds. And I mean, it's really huge. So I just recently saw they're like recruiting 10 ecologists to the governmental agency, which like never happens, to just look at this problem. So I think people are aware of this, and this is now a big issue. And yeah, I'm not that much into that, but it's happening.
Okay. As time is running fast, I really will get in contact with you, Urška, afterwards about the idea of a special issue again. But there's one more question I really would like to ask is, you mentioned that, well, we have that problem with the satellite data, with the models we do about the environmental variables, so to say, and then you correlate them, you make some models, you make some calculations out of that. And there's no ground truth, so to say. Now, my question would be, there is actually even more data available. There's a lot of data available of humans, actually, which might be interested in those birds. So also, the quality might be an issue, but that the quality is an issue for in data science always, I would argue. So have you seen or have you thought about, combining those or fused data from social media, from crowdsourcing, from citizen science into this, so to say, so to get some kind of additional confirmation or validation?
Yeah, so funny you said that, because the International Biologging Society actually started this big initiative on human-wildlife interaction where they are doing precisely that.
Okay.
So International Biologging Society is this big organization which has lots of movement ecologists from all over the world. And in this initiative, it started as the pandemic started, because what they noticed is that in lots of places, animals started behaving differently once we had lockdowns and humans were not actually going around anymore, right? So they recruited all these ecologists who are already tracking animals in some parts of the world, right? I think they have several hundred studies now, to this initiative, that all the data that they get from before, during, and after the pandemic are actually feeding into this. And now they're trying to link that to various human mobility data sets, such as, for example, from the apps such as SafeGraph and Cubic and so on in US, and I think in Glasgow, in UK, you have things like Tampoko from Urban Big Data Center in Glasgow and so on, and also to other kinds of data that could talk about, that could show the level of human activity, such as, for example, satellite data on night lights, because there was much less light pollution when we were all sitting at home and so on. And yeah, there's this big initiative with several sub-projects where they are looking at exactly that, and they're trying to find about how this interaction between human and animals changed during pandemic, but also how animals are affected by humans.
Okay, excellent. Well, Urška, I think we could talk forever now because you have a long list of
I'm very
questions.
excited about this topic, so I have a lot to say.
Yes. So please consider, next year we are going to have the European Cartography Conference in Vienna in September, actually. Please consider to present your ongoing work there as well, and so that can have additional questions to you then.
Okay.
At that moment, I need